September 1993. A Nissan compliance office in Tokyo, Japan. Export manager Yoshio Tanaka sits across from senior executives reviewing foreign market applications for the newly refreshed R33 Skyline lineup. The GTR with its RB26DETT will go to select markets with proper homologation. The GTST with the RB25DET. That's another story. One executive poses the question everyone's avoiding. What about the American market? The RB25DET passes their emission standards. We could offer it in the Skyline. Tanaka shakes his head. We could, but we won't. Why not? It's a 250 horsepower engine, competitive with the Supra and 300ZX. Because the RB25DET uses the same basic architecture as the RB26DETT. It shares 70% of its components. If we export it, American tuners will figure that out in 6 months. Then we'll have people building 500 horsepower RB25s and claiming they never modified them because we never documented what it's actually capable of. Another executive leans forward. You're saying we can't export it because it's too good? I'm saying we can't export it because it's too similar to our flagship engine. The RB26DETT is for heroes who can afford the GTR. The RB25DET is for everyone else. And if everyone else can make GTR power for a third of the price, the GTR loses its mystique. The decision is made. The RB25DET stays in Japan. Australia gets it through local regulations, but America, Europe, and most other markets, forbidden. This is the story of the RB25DET, the engine Nissan deliberately kept from global markets because it was too capable, too affordable, and too close to their flagship RB26. And why that decision created the ultimate forbidden fruit that defined the gray market import scene for a generation. The engine nobody was supposed to want. To understand why Nissan kept the RB25DET from most export markets, you need to understand its awkward position in Nissan's lineup. It wasn't the hero engine, that was the RB26DETT. It wasn't the economy engine, that was the naturally aspirated RB20 series. The RB25DET was the middle child, the compromise, the engine for people who wanted turbocharged performance but couldn't afford a GTR. In 1993, a Skyline GTST with the RB25DET cost about 2.8 million yen in Japan. The GTR cost 4.5 million yen. That's a 60% price difference for a car that looked almost identical. Nissan's product planners saw a problem. If the RB25DET was too good, too close to the RB26's performance, customers would buy the cheaper car. The GTR's exclusivity would be compromised. Its premium pricing would be unjustified. So they made sure the RB25DET stayed in its lane. Official power rating, 250 horsepower, compared to the RB26DETT's 280. Just different enough to justify the GTR's price premium, but there was a secret. That 250 horsepower rating, like everything from Japan in the 1990s, it was a lie. The RB25DT actually made 265 to 275 horsepower, depending on the variant. And more importantly, it used essentially the same internals as the RB26DETT forged crank, strong rods, a block that could handle massive boost. Nissan had built a budget version of their flagship engine. Then they made sure most of the world couldn't buy it because they knew what would happen if tuners got their hands on it. The engine built from borrowed glory. The RB25DET's development story is the opposite of most performance engines. Usually manufacturers build the hero engine first, then make cheaper versions. Nissan did it backward. The RB20DET came first in 1989, a 2.0-liter turbocharged straight six, making 212 horsepower. It was fine, not spectacular, but adequate for mid-range Skylines. Then Nissan developed the RB26DETT for the R32 GTR in 1989, a 2.6-liter twin-turbo monster officially rated at 280 horsepower, but actually making 330 plus. This was the flagship, the engine that would define Nissan's performance reputation. But there was a gap, a 2.0-liter making 212 horsepower and a 2.6-liter making 280 plus. Nothing in between. And Nissan needed something in between because most customers couldn't afford GTRs. In 1991, they split the difference. The RB25DET, a 2.5-liter single-turbo straight six. And here's where it gets interesting. Instead of developing a completely new engine, Nissan essentially built a detuned RB26DETT. They took the RB26's block, removed one cylinder's worth of displacement through shorter stroke, used a single turbo instead of twins, and called it a different engine. But underneath, The DNA was identical. The RB25DET's connecting rods were the same forgings as the RB26DETT. The crankshaft was similarly overbuilt. The block architecture was nearly identical with the same closed-deck design. This was cost-effective engineering. Use proven components from the flagship engine in a cheaper model, save development costs, leverage existing supply chains. But it created an unexpected problem. The RB25DET was essentially a deturbocharged RB26DETT, and any tuner with basic mechanical knowledge could see it. The Australian exception that proved the rule. While most markets never got the RB25DET, Australia did. And what happened there was exactly what Nissan feared would happen everywhere. Australian import regulations were more lenient than America's or Europe's. Japanese spec cars could be imported more easily. And from 1993 onward, RB25DET powered skylines flooded into Australia. Within 2 years, Australian tuning shops had figured it out. The RB25DET wasn't a 250 horsepower engine. It was a 400-plus horsepower engine hiding behind conservative tuning. With basic modifications, boost controller, exhaust, intercooler, the RB25DT would make 300 horsepower. Easy, reliable, on the stock bottom end. More aggressive tuning with a bigger turbo would push 380 to 420 horsepower, still on stock internals. And built motors? The sky was the limit. 600 to 700 horsepower was achievable. Some extreme builds pushed past 900 horsepower. By 1997, RB25DET Skylines were dominating Australian motorsport, drag racing, circuit racing, time attack. The engine that wasn't supposed to compete with the GTR was beating it. And here's the killer. It was doing it for a third of the cost. A used R33 GTST cost 15,000 to 20,000 Australian dollars. A GTR cost 50,000 to 70,000 Australian dollars. For most enthusiasts, the choice was obvious. Nissan watched this happen with growing concern. The Australian market proved their fears were justified. The RB25DET was too good, too close to the RB26. And if it had been exported globally, it would have cannibalized GTR sales worldwide. The gray market that Nissan couldn't stop. But keeping the RB25DET out of markets like America didn't stop Americans from getting them. It just made them more desirable. By the mid-1990s, the gray market import scene was thriving. Japanese cars that weren't officially exported could be imported through various loopholes. Show and display, racing purposes, personal import exemptions. The Skyline GTST with its RB25DET became one of the most popular gray market imports, cheaper than a GTR, easier to register, and with modification potential that matched cars costing twice as much. Import shops in California, Florida, and Texas specialized in bringing over R32 and R33 Skylines with RB25DET engines. They'd navigate the legal gray areas, get the cars titled, and sell them to enthusiasts who wanted Japanese performance without GTR prices. By 2000, there were thousands of RB25DET Skylines in America, despite Nissan never officially selling them. Each one was technically illegal under DOT and EPA regulations. But enforcement was spotty, and most owners flew under the radar, and they were building them. American tuners, once they got their hands on RB25DETs, confirmed what Australian tuners had already known. This engine was special. The modification curve was incredible. Every dollar spent yielded significant power gains. A $5,000 turbo setup would take you from 250 to 400 horsepower. A $12,000 built motor setup would get you to 600 plus. Compare that to building a domestic V8 to the same power level. More expensive, heavier, less exotic. The RB25DET offered Japanese engineering, straight-six smoothness, and monster power potential in a relatively compact package. Nissan couldn't stop it. The engine they had tried to keep from America was here anyway, and it was doing exactly what they feared, creating an affordable alternative to their flagship GTR. The performance ceiling that didn't exist. But what really shocked tuners was discovering that the RB25DET didn't have the weaknesses they expected from a lesser engine. Most detuned engines have compromises: weaker internals, cast cranks instead of forged, thinner cylinder walls. The manufacturer saves money by using cheaper components in the lower spec model. The RB25DET had almost none of these compromises. Because Nissan had built it using RB26 architecture and components, it inherited the RB26's strength. The crankshaft was forged steel, overkill for 250 horsepower, but perfect for 500 plus. The connecting rods were forged, again, stronger than necessary for stock power, but exactly what you needed for big turbo builds. The block was closed deck with thick cylinder walls, the same fundamental design as the RB26DETT. Engine builders started testing the limits. How much power could the stock bottom end handle? The consensus emerged around 450 to 500 horsepower. Beyond that, you'd want forged pistons and ARP head studs. But the crank and rods? Stock was fine up to 700 horsepower in many cases. This was absurd. Nissan had accidentally created a budget engine that could handle power levels matching engines costing 3 times as much. And the modification path was straightforward. The RB25DT responded to boost like it was designed for it, because it essentially was. The turbo system could be upgraded easily. The fuel system had headroom. The ECU could be tuned. Everything about the RB25DET suggested Nissan had built in massive safety margins, not because they expected customers to modify it, but because they'd used RB26 engineering standards and simply detuned the result. The single turbo advantage nobody talked about. Here's something interesting that separated the RB25DET from the RB26DETT: the single turbo. The RB26DETT used a complex twin-turbo system, 2 smaller turbos providing response and power across the RPM range. But this system was complicated, expensive to maintain, and ultimately limited in upgrade potential because you had to upgrade 2 turbos instead of 1. The RB25DET used a single turbo, simpler, more reliable, and crucially, much easier and cheaper to upgrade. Want more power from an RB26? You're replacing 2 turbos. That's $4,000 to $6,000 in parts plus complex installation. Want more power from an RB25? Replace 1 turbo. $2,000 to $3,000 and simpler installation. By 2005, the aftermarket had developed complete turbo upgrade paths for the RB25DET, Garrett GT 3076R for 400 horsepower. Precision, 6.2, 6.6, and for 550 horsepower. Borg-Warner EFR for 650 plus horsepower. Each upgrade was bolt-on, well-documented, with tuning files and support readily available. The RB25DET had become the easier, cheaper path to big power compared to the RB26DETT. And tuners noticed something else. The RB25DET's single turbo gave it a different power delivery character. Less top-end rush than the RB26, but more mid-range punch. For street driving and circuit racing, many people preferred it. The engine Nissan built as the compromise was actually more practical than the flagship for many applications. It was lighter, simpler, cheaper to modify, and almost as capable. The drift tax that made everything worse. In the early 2000s, drifting exploded in popularity, and one of the most popular drift platforms was the Nissan Silvia, also known as the 240SX, with an RB25DET swap. The swap made sense. The RB25DET was a straight 6 that fit where the stock 4-cylinder sat. It provided massive power in a lightweight chassis, and the straight 6 torque was perfect for braking traction and maintaining slides. But this created a supply problem. Demand for RB25DET engines skyrocketed, and supply was limited because Nissan had only sold them in Japan and a few other markets. Prices climbed. In 2000, a good RB25DET engine cost $2,500 to $3,500 imported from Japan. By 2005, $4,000 to $5,000. By 2010, $5,500 to $7,500. The budget RB engine was becoming expensive. Not as pricey as an RB26DETT at $10,000 to $15,000, but no longer the cheap alternative. And because Nissan had stopped production of the RB25DET in 1998, with the end of the R34 Skyline, the supply was finite. Every RB25DET destroyed in a drift car or blown up by an inexperienced tuner was one less available for the next buyer. By 2015, clean RB25DET engines were rare. Most available cores had high mileage or unknown histories. The golden age of cheap RB25DET swaps was over. The emissions problem Nissan never fixed. But there was a legitimate reason Nissan didn't export the RB25DET to all markets: emissions compliance. The RB25DET, particularly the early versions, were not clean engines by modern standards. The single turbo system with its wastegate and blow-off valve created emissions issues. The engine ran rich under boost to protect against detonation. Getting the RB25DET certified for American emission standards would have required secondary air injection systems, more sophisticated catalytic converters, revised tuning that would hurt performance, extensive testing and certification. Nissan estimated the cost at $15 to $25 million to certify the RB25DET for the US market. And for what? To sell a mid-range Skyline that would compete with their own 300ZX? The business case didn't exist, especially when Nissan knew the engine would be immediately modified, making the emissions certification pointless. But here's what's interesting. Nissan could have developed a cleaner, more export-friendly RB25DET. The technology existed. Other manufacturers were building turbocharged engines that met global emission standards. They chose not to, because developing an export-friendly RB25DET meant acknowledging it as a global performance engine, and that meant it would compete directly with the GTR's halo status. Keeping the RB25DET Japan only wasn't just about emissions. It was about market segmentation and protecting the GTR's image, the engine swap that defined a generation. Despite never being officially exported to America, the RB25DT became one of the most popular engine swaps of the 2000s, particularly in Nissan's own chassis. The S13/S14240SX was the most common recipient, a lightweight rear-drive sports car that came with a weak, naturally aspirated four-cylinder. Drop in an RB25DET, and you had a car that could run with Supras and Corvettes. The swap had become so refined by 2008 that companies offered complete bolt-in kits, engine mounts, transmission adapters, wiring harnesses, drive shafts. Everything needed to complete the swap with basic tools. A complete RB25DET swap cost $8,000 to $12,000, including labor. That's less than building the stock KA24DE to 300 horsepower. And you got straight six smoothness, turbo power, and endless upgrade potential. But the irony was perfect. Nissan never officially sold the RB25DET in America. Yet thousands of American Nissan chassis were running RB25DET power. The engine they tried to keep out had become synonymous with American Nissan performance culture. And it wasn't just 240SXs. The RB25DET showed up in 300ZXs, swapped to replace the VG30DETT for more reliability. In first-gen Xterras, creating weird Japanese V6-powered SUVs, even in Datsun 510s and 240Zs, carrying on decades-old platform with modern power. The RB25DET had become the people's RB, the straight six anyone could afford and everyone could modify. Nissan had tried to make it Japanese market only. Enthusiasts made it global anyway. The 25/30 that should have existed. By the mid-2000s, enthusiasts had discovered another interesting possibility. The RB25DET block could be stroked to 2.8 or 3.0 liters using RB30 components from Australian Nissan trucks. The RB30 was a 3.0-liter, naturally aspirated straight six used in Australian Nissan Patrols. It had a longer stroke than the RB25, and crucially, many components were interchangeable. Someone figured out you could take an RB25DET block, install RB30 pistons and crank, and create a 2.8-liter or 3.0-liter turbocharged engine. The combination became known as an RB28DET or RB30DET. The results were shocking. The increased displacement provided massive torque. An RB30DET would make 400 horsepower with stock turbo and conservative boost. With upgraded turbo, 600 plus horsepower was easily achievable. And the power delivery was unlike anything else. The RB30DET had the torque of a V8 with the smoothness of a straight six and the high RPM capability of the RB series. It was the ultimate Nissan engine, more displacement than the RB26DETT, easier to build than the RB26, cheaper than both, and Nissan never built it. They had all the components. They knew about the combination because Australian tuners had been building RB30S since the 1990s, but they never offered it as a production engine. Why? Because an RB30DET would have made everything else in their lineup obsolete. It would have been too good, too capable, too affordable. So, enthusiasts built it themselves, proving once again that the aftermarket would finish what manufacturers refused to start, what Nissan won't admit. Today, when journalists ask Nissan about the RB25DET, they get diplomatic non-answers. The RB25DET was an important engine for the Japanese domestic market. It provided good performance for customers who wanted turbocharged power. No mention of why it was never exported. No acknowledgement of the thriving gray market. Nothing about its modification potential or its role in building Nissan's performance reputation outside Japan. But talk to former Nissan engineers and you hear a different story. We knew the RB25DET was too close to the RB26DETT in capability. One engineer admitted, if we'd exported it globally, GTR sales would have collapsed. Why buy a 4.5 million yen GTR when you could buy a 2.8 million yen GTST that performed almost as well after basic modifications. The decision to keep it JDM wasn't about emissions or regulations. It was about protecting the GTR's premium positioning. We couldn't have a budget engine performing at flagship levels. Another engineer was more blunt. The RB25DET proved that high performance doesn't require high prices. You could build a 500 horsepower RB25DET for less than the cost of a stock GTR. That's bad for business when your business model depends on selling expensive halo cars. So we kept it out of export markets and pretended it didn't exist. And when people imported them anyway and proved they were amazing, we acted surprised. The question Nissan can't answer. Here's what keeps me thinking. If the RB25DET was such a problem, why did Nissan keep building it through 3 Skyline generations? The R32 had it, the R33 had it, the R34 had it. From 1991 to 1998, 7 years of production. If it was truly cannibalizing GTR sales or creating problems, they would have killed it, but they didn't. Because in Japan, the RB25DET sold. It gave customers turbocharged straight-six performance at an accessible price. It filled a market need. The problem was never the engine. The problem was, what would happen if everyone could have it? The RB25DET's appeal depended partly on its exclusivity. Keep it rare, keep it special. And here's the bigger question. What if Nissan had embraced the RB25DET globally? What if they'd certified it for American emissions and sold it officially? Would the Skyline have competed with the Supra and 300ZX? Would it have built Nissan's performance reputation earlier? Or would it have destroyed the GTR's mystique and undermined their premium strategy? Drop your take in the comments. Should Nissan have exported the RB25DET globally? Or was keeping it JDM only the smart move that made it more desirable? And here's what I really want to know. If Nissan announced tomorrow they were bringing back the RB25DET with modern technology, direct injection, and global compliance, would that engine succeed? Or has the world moved past straight 6 turbos? Because maybe that's the real lesson of the RB25DET. Sometimes the forbidden fruit is the sweetest. Sometimes the thing you can't have is exactly what you want most. Nissan tried to keep the RB25DET from the world. The world took it anyway. Through gray market imports, through Australia, through any method available. And in doing so, enthusiasts proved something Nissan didn't want to admit. You don't need the most expensive engine to have the most fun. You don't need the flagship to compete with the flagship. Sometimes the middle child, the compromise engine, the one that wasn't supposed to be special, turns out to be the best of all. The RB25DET was Japan's secret until it wasn't. Until enthusiasts around the world made it their secret too. This is the JDM engine archive. The RB25DET was never supposed to leave Japan, but it escaped anyway, and it's been breaking the rules ever since. Some engines are built to be exported, some engines are too good to keep contained. Catch you next time.